you for all of that, and thank you very much for coming this evening. If at any point you can't hear me, just wave your hand, or if anything's unclear, please do the same. What I'm going to say is prompted by a paradox, a tension between two things that are going on. In the world of educational assessment, which almost all of us are something to do with, there's an awful lot being said about fairness. It's very fashionable now as a topic in educational assessment, not just with geeks who are particularly into it all, but also with pupils and their parents. You know, the questions that we had in the A-level weren't fair because we weren't expecting them, things like that. And there's an increasing interest among the theoreticians in it, and it seems to be joining validity and reliability as values in assessment. Validity, that an assessment assesses what it's supposed to do, the right construct, and reliability, that if you were to assess the same thing again, you get broadly the same outcomes. But fairness seems to be coming along and joining them. And also, in recent years, there's, I think most of us would think, been quite a lot of gains in understanding about fairness, both in theory, but also, perhaps more important, in practice, with good practice in how to make all our tests and exams more fair. Now, if you were an American assessment person, you would sleep with this under your pillow every night. This is the document in America called Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, and it comes out about every 4 or 5 years, and it's very expensive despite looking rather small. And it sets out industry standards, really, principles and standards, and they're always used as how test organizations in the United States should work. Now, the 2014 edition, which is the most recent one, has now got a separate chapter on fairness at the beginning of that, which was a big deal for the people who read it, and it has about 10 or 11 principles for fairness. So that shows how important fairness is supposed to be. So arguably, we've been trying to make our assessments and our tests more fair. That's good. However, at the same time, there's been increasing worry about the social justice of the contexts in which some of our exams and tests are used. And the example I'm going to return to in this talk is the use of end of secondary school grades, for example, A-level grades or Scottish Highers or BTECs or IB or something like that for entry to university. And there's been concern about that, about the social justice of that system. And how can you be doing all this work on fair assessments if they seem to be in an unfair world? And that's the problem. Can a national exam, let's say an A-level, be fair if the way it's used isn't fair? Is that right? Are there options which would help to resolve the problem? And then, this is a really crunchy one, what is the responsibility of the assessment community, that's some of us in this room, for the way that our assessments are used and the fairness of that? So I'm going to start by saying a little bit conceptually about fairness, which isn't terribly profound, but just trying to sort out what the word actually means. Then to say quite a bit about fairness in assessment. I'm going to outline what I think is the received view in the literature and make some criticisms of it. And then talk a little bit about a court case in the United States, which some of you may know about, but the others will not. A little bit more about justice in society, as distinct from fairness in exams, and how they're related. And then I'm going to return to this question of using A-level grades or their equivalent for a university entrance and think, is this fair? Is there something we should be doing about it? And at the very end, I'm going to come back to this nasty question about what our responsibility is, personal responsibility is for all of this. So, starting with fairness in assessment. I think it's helpful to distinguish a number of senses of fair, not for the sake of it, but because an awful lot of discussion is just a muddle of the different senses and people don't know what they mean. One of them, I think, is just a formal sense, something fair if it's accurate, and it follows a rule or a guidance accurately. So if the rule says the ball needs to be completely out to be out, and it is out, then you've followed the rule, whether it's a good rule or a bad rule. More interesting is what I've called a contractual sense, and something's fair if it meets the legitimate expectations of those affected by it. And I mentioned the people who tweet after the maths exam, it was terribly unfair. We got this question that we've never covered in the course, so they felt their legitimate expectations weren't met. There's then the sense that I've called relational, which is that relevantly like cases are treated alike. So candidate A is treated the same way as candidate B. It doesn't mean the outcomes are the same for both of them, but they're relevantly treated alike. And that's often related to the so-called golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. And there's another one which I've called retributive, which is that there's something that's fair if people get the outcome they deserve. And this is very strong in Southeast Asia when I was working there, because there's a big Confucian tradition that good outcomes are really the result of effort and hard work. And we tend to emphasize ability, but they think it's you deserve what you got. So there's a feeling of deserving there. Now, in writing about assessment, there's nearly always a focus on the relational sense, about candidates being treated similarly, and often the other senses are ignored, and that's not a good thing, but it's a very important sense, but it's not the only one. And just to give you an example, some of you may know of this episode, but in 2012 there was a great row about GCSE English, and there was a legal case by some complainants against Ofqual and some of the exam boards, because there was a feeling, and this is summarising heroically, but there was a feeling that the grades in the June exam were lower than they expected. And this was the legitimate expectations sense of fairness, and the judge actually, in the judgment, defined that and what it meant by legitimate expectations. But there was also the complaint that the June candidates were not treated the same way as the January candidates. And so that was unfair in the relational sense. So one lot were not treated the same as the other. And then Ofqual said, oh, well, that's all very well, but what about the relational sense with the previous year? Because they thought the January ones were a little bit generous. And in fact, the judgment said at one point, there was no way that any of the outcomes of this trial could be fair to everybody concerned. So there's a feeling that we're just in a bad situation. So you saw there the different senses being used against each other. Now, what are we talking about? Fairness of what? Well, often we're looking about aspects of the test or the exam or the assessment that you're running. The type of assessment used, for example, whether you use extended answers or multiple choice, the actual having an exam rather than using a portfolio of evidence, the big argument about one-off exams versus modules, and a feeling that one lot tends to favour girls and one lot tends to favour boys. You'll be familiar with that. But there's also issues about the design of an exam or a test, the question paper development, the marking, the grading scheme, the administration, the scoring, the reporting of the outcomes. Each of these stages has a little bit of a literature about how to do it fairly. And there's also the issue of the uses that are made of test outcomes, not necessarily made by the same people who ran the tests, but by somebody else. But this is a question that's not asked enough. This is fairness to whom? On the whole, the people who write about assessment assume that the only people you're thinking about are the candidates, or the test takers, as they call them in America. What about their peers? Perhaps some of them didn't sit the test because they thought it'd be too hard. What about users of the assessment outcome? For example, the admissions tutors here, for example, people who are looking at A-level results. What about fairness to them? What about society at large? And then when we've got professional qualifications, you heard that I'd worked on medical regulation. There's issues about the future clients of the person who's passed a particular competency test, for example, an accountancy qualification or a legal qualification. They have a right to expect, a legitimate expectation that they'll know what they're doing. And if that wasn't met, it'd be unfair to them. So it's not just the candidates. And this, I think, is what you will read in the textbooks, or you will have read in the textbooks, the received view. Some people vary, but this is a kind of clustering of what the main thing is. Mainly, it's assumed that fairness is entirely about candidates or groups of candidates, which they often look at. And it's usually linked to some unfairness, is usually linked to some sort of bias. And there's a view that a test or an exam is unfair if the outcomes for different groups of candidates or different candidates differ, not because of something that you're supposed to be examining, like how good they are at maths or English or whatever, but for something completely different, which is not relevant to the construct being assessed. So it's a construct irrelevant attribute, like their gender or their nationality or the fact that they were colourblind and couldn't read the news, they couldn't read the question paper or something like that. And the good practice in the received view, and this is all good stuff, is to minimise the risk of bias of that kind, this construct irrelevant bias, in advance at the design stage, by thinking of these things in advance. And for example, the wording of tasks and questions, avoiding words which are not necessary for what you're asking and are unfamiliar to the students. So for example, if you're measuring a quadrilateral in a house, you're saying you're measuring the patio. Well, you'll have lots of students who've never seen a patio, have no experience of a patio. You don't need to say patio. So it's that kind of vigilance about those. The presentation of the assessment itself, the colour of the diagrams, the print size. There's very good guidance by the Royal National Institute of the Blind. The audibility of recorded speech, and some of you may have memories of shonky cassettes for French oral and all the rest of it. Arrangements for the administration of the test, including provision for candidates with disabilities. You're all familiar with this. And in the United States, this is summarised under the phrase universal design, and that's what they go for. In this country, we've tended to call it fairness by design. Yes?
How about the middleman, the person that has to transmit the knowledge, the educator that has to transmit the knowledge to the candidates of that assessment? What if there's a barrier in getting your educators to understand how the assessment's being taken, how to mark the assessment, how to teach that assessment? The
whole process of teaching, I completely agree with you there. There's a whole process beyond the actual assessment itself. If I may, I'm going to come back to that because that's highly relevant.
Cool.
It's highly relevant to the American case that I'm going to talk about in a second. But if you feel I haven't done justice to it, wave again.
Wave again.
Okay. The regulators in this country put out publications called Fair Assessment by Design. I think Ofqual's withdrawn it now because they've tried to consolidate their guidance, but you can still get it if you do a bit of Googling, and it's excellent. It's really good stuff. Also, that's all in advance. There's also analysis in arrears, which is what the psychometricians do. After a test's actually been sat, they will look at it and say, was this unfair? And what they do is get groups which are defined by some construct irrelevant factor, like gender or nationality, or those for whom the language of the test was a second language, but who are similar in the ability that's being tested, established by some independent source. And then they do a statistical exercise to compare the two. And if there's different outcomes for people of the same mathematical ability, but who had English as a second language, they think there's something wrong with the assessment. And this is called differential functioning analysis, or DIF analysis, and there's a whole literature about ways of doing that. Now, just a few comments from me about this. I mentioned the different senses of fairness. All the stuff I've been talking about is entirely about what I've called relational fairness. It's about some candidates compared to other candidates. That's all it is. They don't look at all at other aspects. And sometimes it doesn't matter very much, I would suggest. If you've got a driving test and you've got town A and town B, you've got Hatfield and St Albans, and in Hatfield there's a grumpy examiner who doesn't like people from ethnic minorities, and he's judging very severely, but the examiner in St Albans is fine and is very fair and does it all correctly. The important thing is that the people in Hatfield didn't get correctly and marked, and they didn't get the outcome that they deserved. It's nothing to do with how they compare to people in St Albans. It doesn't matter to them that the people in St Albans got better treatment. It's about the standard and about the individuals. The sense of unfairness is much weaker generally, and I'll come back to this, if there's no competitive access. It wasn't the people in St Albans and in Hatfield were competing for 20 places for driving. It was just that they were doing separate things. The received model tends to neglect this legitimate expectation sense of fairness, and it doesn't sit easily with competency tests. It sits more easily with sort of traditional school exams and not so well with some other kinds of assessments. Also, I'd suggest there's too much focus on groups. In fact, there's some textbooks that say that fairness can only be about groups. That seems a very odd thing to say, because you would say it was unfair on me. You would say, you wouldn't, I'm a group and it was unfair on me. Some of the traditional groups, this all goes back, I think, to the legal definitions of discrimination and the various qualifying groups that counted towards that. But nowadays, this is very much felt in the United States, the ethnic groups that were defined before are becoming much less distinct because of second and third generations. Also, some groups or some categories of candidate, for example, those with very severe disabilities, there's so few of them that you can't do the diff analyses. Just statistically, there aren't enough to do it. And then what about fairness to individuals? I think if you, I don't know if there's anybody here from an exam board, but if you talk to anybody who is and buy them a drink or two, they'll probably tell you there's 1 or 2 exams that they do that have 2 candidates or something like that. They're just run for reasons that they're expected to do it. And you've got to be fair to those as well. Now, the links with other assessment concepts are quite debated. Usually, fairness is linked to what's often called comparability, that candidates A is treated the same way as candidate B. And going back to that GCSE example, the people in June were treated the same way as the people in January. But sometimes people are so obsessed with comparability, particularly in this country and particularly in England, that they simply rule out of consideration lots of other kinds of assessment that can produce very rich information about candidates, like in computer testing, adaptive testing, where you can go on different paths depending on who you are. And so I could go on one path and Lynn would go on a different path. So we couldn't be compared strictly, but you've got very good information about both of us, and also about value-added options for applications to university. The relation to validity is not clear, and there's a whole sort of theology about validity. Can a test be valid and not fair? There are some people who use the word valid to mean whatever's good about a test. So in that case, it's just a tautology that it can't be. But most people are not as wide as that, and they're concerned about that. There's also a lack of consensus about fairness of use, and this is sometimes called consequential validity as well. How far down the line do you go? Supposing that I'm in Pearson and I'm doing a GCSE maths, do we go 10 years down the line when this exam is still being used? Does it make sense to link that to the exam itself? So there's a question there about how you do that. And now I'm going to talk about the challenge from the courts. Can I just ask if anybody's heard of this case? Deborah P. Right. I'll just tell you about it a little bit. And I hope that the lady in the middle table will feel that this is a bit relevant to what you've asked about. This is a United States case, and the people who sleep with this under their pillow all know about Deborah P. And they agonize about it. The states of, goes back right to the late 1970s. The states of Florida wanted to improve educational standards. I think we've heard that somewhere before. And so they decided in 1976 that people who are graduating from high school, you get a diploma when you graduate from high school, as well as doing all the things that they had to do, they would have to pass a new test, which was called a functional literacy test, which was a bit like functional skills, which some of you are essential skills, have got different words, those kinds of tests. And they were supposed to be testing very basic skills that you should have had for years. And this new test was introduced in 1977, and this is what happened. If you just have a look at that. That shows how the black students did compared to the white students. And it doesn't take a mathematical genius to realise there's something gone horribly wrong there. I mean, it's really drastic difference between the... So there was a challenge. Deborah P., who was a student, a black student, and 10 of her friends and their mothers and various supporting organisations took a case against the education authorities. And never mind about the legal basis, it was under the US constitutional law and also civil rights law, but never mind about that. The initial findings, this came back several times, the initial findings were that all the students who failed, not just the black ones, but the white ones too, were denied what they were entitled to expect, a legitimate expectation, which they thought was a kind of property, but that's an American thing, by the rushed implementation of the new test, the way it was rushed in. And the black students were denied due process and that kind of fairness by not necessarily being taught all the things that the content tested. And sometimes the reason they weren't taught it was not anything recent, it was years before when there were still segregated schools in Florida. So the education department was told they could not make the diploma dependent on passing this test for at least 4 or 5 years, till there was time for the schools to prepare for it and for the teachers to know what was going to be taught and to teach it. Both parties appealed. Only in America could that happen. And then the first time it went round again, the judgment backed up the original judgment, but required the authority to do detailed research on what was actually being taught in the schools throughout the state. And they didn't even do a sample. They did a huge, 100% survey of all of this. Then they came back in 1983 with the results of the survey, and the court said, well, you've shown that all the schools are covering this now, so you can run the test as a condition of a high school diploma as long as you provide some special help to people who fail it. And that's where it ended up. Now, why am I telling you all about this? Well, the judges decided they would invent a bit of assessment theory while they were at it. And they said that the discussion about the test had ignored what they called curricular validity. And they defined it as things that are currently taught. And if you think about an English exam board, that's not about anything to do with the exam board at all. It's about the schools, things that are currently taught. And they got a panjandrum from an education department to look to testify how valid the test was, that it was reliably and validly assessed applications of basic communications and math skills to everyday situations. But this professor agreed that everything on the test might not have been taught. And then the judges got a bit worked up. At the 11th hour, and with virtually no warning, this class, the one I put the stats up about, were told that the requirements for graduation had been changed. They were suddenly required to pass a test constructed under pressure of time and covering content that was presumed to be elementary, but that their schools may or may not have taught them recently, well, or perhaps at all. We believe that the state administered a test that was fundamentally unfair. Not that the schools were doing something unfair. The test was unfair, is what the court said. And there it was. Now, what, if anything, is the relevance of that story to us? Well, we don't have the same constitutional law. We don't have the same civil rights law, although we've got analogous things, including due process requirements that could lead to judicial review. But what about the concepts? What about this curricular validity idea? What about the unfair test because it was rushed in before the schools had prepared for it, and that they weren't covering up for things that had happened before? And who's responsible in this country for this curricular validity, if it exists? In England, for example, is it the exam boards? If you think of academic exams. What about the schools? What about the regulator? I used to be the head of the regulator. The government, if you can blame the government, that's good. And in Wales, you've heard that I'm on the board of Qualifications Wales. Our chief executive and our chair recently appeared before a Senedd Select Committee. It's rather like the Parliamentary Select Committees in Westminster. And they pressed and pressed and pressed them on the availability of Welsh language textbooks for the revised GCSEs. They'd been under enormous pressure from the government to get through the new revised GCSEs to fit in with the timetable in England before the publishers had got round to producing Welsh language textbooks. So that's rather like the Deborah P case. Is that unfair? And whose fault is it? So those are all questions. I'm going to be more questions than answers this evening, I'm afraid. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second and jump to talk not about assessment, but about justice in society. And this is going to be 2,000 years of philosophy in 35 seconds or something, but never mind. Really, from Aristotle, I'm thinking of the politics as well as the ethics and beyond, the philosophers have distinguished between a wide sense of justice, meaning what's right, and righteousness or virtue, and a narrow, much more particular one, which, in his case, he looked at the ways that things were distributed or how people got the recompense for what they'd done. And he allowed that people might not all get the same benefits or the same outcomes, but there had to be some sort of rationale for it. The rationale didn't quite cover women and slaves, but we'll not say anything about that. And then we're jumping 2,000 years to John Rawls, who wrote this. This is a very tatty copy of the 1970s theory of justice, but is the most influential writer about justice really for the last 50 years. And his view was that justice, social justice, is a kind of fairness. And he had two requirements for the just society. One was what he called equality of consideration. And this is that Lynn and I, our interests should be valued equally. We may not get the same outcomes, but what happens to me is of the same value as what happens to Lynn. And the other was what he called the difference principle. And the idea was if you're judging what is a fair thing to happen in society, you can imagine what he called a veil of ignorance, that you don't know whether you're very well off or not, or you're very clever or very not very clever, but you're saying if you don't know who you are and how well advantaged you are, what would you want to happen? And his theory was that what we would want to happen would be to maximize the interest of the least well off in society, because that's what we might be. So we'd want to make sure that the worst off got the best outcome that they could. And he didn't say that justice meant the same as fairness, but it was a substantive comment. Now, I mean, this is a great summary, and it prompted 50 years of people making a living by writing articles. But forgetting about that, there's just one or two points which it is worth remembering, because there's an awful lot of similarities with the discussion about assessment. It's never been clear what the currency was, as they call it, for well-being. You know, when I said you didn't know how well off you are, what does that mean? What do you mean well off? Do you mean more money, or do you mean happier, or something else, or healthy, for example, or living longer, or what? Having a family, or whatever. And Amartya Sen talked about the capability to function. He thought that was a basic thing that you're talking about, the quality of that. And that's quite relevant when we come back to assessment. And then there was the question of how we decide what would be acceptable to the worst off, even if you follow this pattern. And how do you just sort of guess, or do you have some principle that you follow to ask that? And then there was difficulty with incorporating the Confucian ideas of responsibility, that you should get what you deserve, and if you work hard, you should get more than if you're lazy. So there's lots of debate about that, and people probably in this university are still writing articles about it. But there are common grounds there between the assessment theorists and the philosophers. They all see some link between justice and fairness, including those who are writing about assessment in the standards. Both the theoretical discussions of fairness by the assessors and by the philosophers allow for some inequalities of outcomes. No assessment people think that a fair exam is one where everybody gets the same mark, for example. Everybody allows that, if justified. There's some link with equality of opportunity in this society, which is another concept that comes in here, although it's not very clear how far the assessment theorists take that. And I'm going to suggest to you this evening that there's an underlying tension between two paradigms that both the assessors and the philosophers tend to go for. And I think they can be questioned. They tend to go for one of the two without questioning it. Now, this is not totally original. I'm borrowing and I've adapted something that my old tutor from days past, R.N. Hare, the philosopher, and Jonathan Wolfe from the University of Oxford has written more recently. This is the first paradigm that people tend uncritically to think of when they're thinking of assessments. And it is the cake. This is about slicing up the cake of benefits of some kind. Some people get bigger slices and some people get smaller slices. And if I get a big slice, that means you get a smaller slice. Tough luck, I did better. You've got winners and losers. And the emphasis is on the grounds for differentiation between individuals. And there are people who stand up and say, the purpose of assessment is to differentiate between candidates. That's what people say. And so it's about cutting up the cake and having a fair slice of the cake. And that's what it is. But the second paradigm is different. And you're not going to be able to read that, but I'll tell you what it is. It's the proficiency test. Now, when I lived in Singapore, Singapore is a very methodical place. They have, this is all run by the Department of Education, they have a swimming proficiency test. And they have requirements for each level, and they have a number of minutes and seconds. You have to do front crawl, breaststroke, backstroke, and then they have all the different levels up to level 6. So, and you've got sea lion, turtle, blah, blah, blah. Whale is the best. Whale is, you've got to do a mile in a certain number of minutes. Now, if everybody got whale, you know, the Singaporeans would measure it very carefully and they'd check the timing, but they'd be delighted if everybody got whale. It's not a competition. It's about how well you can do. I remember when I was at Ofqual, a minister who will be nameless, saying to me, I'm not sure about this exam. How many people fail is what he wanted to know. And this was a cake mentality. But for the swimming, they want everybody to do well. And the emphasis, it doesn't mean you just throw in these awards and anybody can get it for just turning up. They've got to meet the requirements. But the emphasis is on accuracy, that sense of fairness, and motivation. It's not on cutting up the cake. Now, I'm going to return now to the problem I mentioned at the beginning of this, which is about use of A-level grades or whatever for access to universities. And this is not just a problem in this country. I've given some examples there from the research by Pearson from other countries, just mentioned that China, children from poor or rural backgrounds 7 times less likely to enter higher education. And a In Italy, a child of a parent with tertiary education is 9 times more likely to go to university. These are very common trends. And in the UK and the USA, there's a feeling that these gaps, despite the best efforts of everybody, are getting worse. Particularly the gaps between the very top group of socioeconomic groups and the very bottom group. The middle tends to be coalescing a bit, but the top and the bottom seem to be dividing. And there's some quotes there. And there's the top one from the Educational Policy Institute. Persistently disadvantaged, that they defined as people who are eligible for free school meals for 80% or more of their school lives, 2 years behind their peers by the end of secondary school. And there's some examples from the United States. And I wanted to mention 2 writers from the United States, one in particular, but one's Joseph Stiglitz, The Price of Inequality, which is a telling book. But the other one I wanted to mention was Robert Putnam. And he wrote this super book called Our Kids, which I do recommend, The American Dream in Crisis. And it's based on interviews with a whole generation of students who were in his generation in a middle American town and what happened to them. It's not just about education, but also about differing fortunes in health and in employment and in family life and all the rest of it. And one of the findings, a lot of it was bringing together primary sources from elsewhere. One of the ones was the shocking finding that poor kids who succeed academically, that's, for example, do well at the end of secondary school, are less likely to graduate from college than richer kids who do badly at school. And that's, again, probably difficult for you to read. But there you'll see, this is the likelihood, the percentage that complete college, from depending what the scores are from their tests at the end of school. And this is the rich kids, and these are the poor kids. These are the rich kids with the lowest marks, 30% of them complete college. These are the poor kids with the highest marks, and 29% of them complete college. And I mean, there's lots of other injustices in that whole diagram. It's a shocker, really. And Robert Putnam argues that the difference is getting worse. What this is over time, growing gap in gaining a college degree by family income. And this is the bottom quartile. It's sort of plonking along the bottom. But look at the upper quartile with all the fact that kind of reinforcement activities and enriching learning and all this is much more privatized to the family and becomes much more separate. And so there's a worry that it seems to be getting worse. Now, there's an enormous amount to debate about that, and you may not accept. I've just picked a few examples. But just for this evening, if we accept that these reports are accurate, just for the moment, and if we consider that that state of affairs is a bit worrying, which I think everybody would, what are we going to do about it? Are the outcomes of the assessments, the school grades, the A-levels, for example, are they fair? What are the limits to their fair use, and what can be done about it? Now, I'm going to leave you with just to think about 2 options, which you may want just to reject immediately and think complete nonsense, in which case I'll come back to you and say, well, what are you going to do about it then? This is the first. It is that you'd have different scoring for disadvantaged groups. So you set different grade boundaries, perhaps for those ones that had the 80% of their time in free school meals. You set different grade boundaries for grade A, grade B, and all the rest of it, linked to some national definition of poverty or disadvantage. Now, in case you're thinking, what a stupid idea, those of you who know the Irish system of the Leaving Certificate, you may know that students who sit the Leaving Certificate in the language of Irish get up to an additional 10 marks for each subject for doing so, not just for language subjects, but also for things like physics and geography and all the rest of it. And that has been evaluated and gone on for quite a long time. Now, I would suggest that for this, again, don't just rule it out immediately. I think it'd be important to be clear what the justification of this rather dramatic action was. Would it be to compensate for disadvantage in the past? Would it be a different view of the construct being assessed? You're not assessing achievement, really, because these students are 2 years behind, as we've seen. You're looking at potential or something like that. Or is it about motivating disadvantaged students? Well, depending on the justification, there could be tests of whether that would actually make any difference. And I think it's fair to say that the assessment, the evaluations of the Irish system are that it causes an awful lot of palaver, but it doesn't really make awfully much difference. The other thing I would say is that if you're going to fiddle around with the scores, it makes it very difficult to use the scores to measure social mobility. A boss who I worked for in the QCA used to say to us, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure, and you'll be familiar with that. And there's a lot of sense in that. There's also practical problems of implementation. The definition of the groups, the fact that upper middle class parents seem to be able to get around every single way of defining disadvantaged groups. And also there's an issue you might feel about the effect on confidence in the system as a whole. Kane wrote about that if you are breaching what he called consistent meaning across score groups, which sounds a bit geeky, but what he's saying is if you do that, you lose a confidence in the whole thing. It all seems to mean different things for different people, and the person in the street might think there's something a bit odd about this. So that's the first proposal, and you may or may not like it, but here's the second one. It's to set differential score requirements or grade requirements for university entrance by different groups. And there's examples of policy articles that have recommended this. There's a publication in Scotland, 2016, that suggested that the universities should set their requirements at the minimum required to complete the course and not to use inflated requirements as a way of trying to distinguish among excess demand. The Higher Education Policy Institute have published a number of proposals there, but perhaps Bolivar is one of the most vocal of the advocates, who suggests for courses that say you require 3 A grades, disadvantaged students defined in some way should be required to have 3 C grades. So say you need A, and A, but if you're a disadvantaged, you need C, C, and C. And that's the proposal. Now, there's a lot of objections to this. One is that it's lowering standards, and that you could hear people saying that. And the author said, well, it depends what it is that you're measuring. If you're measuring potential, you're not necessarily lowering standards because these students have fallen behind. The other argument was you're setting them up to fail, was the words used. And in fact, Bolivar said there was something in that if you just chucked people into a demanding university course with lower grades without any support while they were going through the course. And so there's an issue about that. But what about that? Well, I would suggest that a lot of it, the fairness or unfairness, depends on what your criteria are for entrance to the university. Are you trying to pick people who are capable of completing the course and not dropping out? People who are likely to get the best degree outcome, which is a different thing. Perhaps those who've got potential to be outstanding scholars in their subject or a Nobel scientist or whatever. Those who've got the most to gain from the course or from being at a university, and that's the campus experience is something that's greatly valued and emphasised in this university. Or what about suitability for a profession? Now, the Royal Colleges of Medicine, they've got their heads together to try and set out 11 or 12 attributes of a doctor, and they've been asking the medical schools to use those for selection as well as A-level grades. Well, I would suggest to you that the validity of use of these grades, it depends on these criteria. If you're looking for potential, then that's a different matter altogether. If you're looking for achievement, then that might be different again. If the rules for these different groups were clear and applied accurately, then they'd meet the formal requirements, a bit like the ball has to be out the court. I mean, it's just a rule and you'd follow it. But what about relational fairness? What about a student from a well-off family with grades of B, B and B, who does not get into the university, and in favour of another student from a poor family who gets C, C and C? And I know of a parent who is from a highly educationally qualified family who said to his son, you're going to have a really tough time because Cambridge like poor students and you've got to be even better than them. It's not fair, is what he said. But supposing this student, well, I didn't ask to be born into a well-off family. I've worked really hard and I got my B's, and look at this guy got C's and he's been put in favour of me. Well, what I would say is that there's a bit of a tendency to go back to the cake paradigm again, that if you get in, I don't get in. And there are highly selective university courses. Medical school is the most famous across the world because it's so expensive to train doctors that you can only have a small number. But an awful lot of universities are not quite like that. They're a bit more like the Singapore swimming test. and they're trying to find out about students who would benefit from the course. So some of them, it's better to use the proficiency paradigm, and a lot of universities are trying hard to attract students and to recruit them. Where there is competition for limited places, there may have to be, I would suggest, a trade-off between social justice and relational fairness. And thinking of this guy who got his BBB, it may be that he will be the casualty of that. And this is a quote I had from Dick Hare again, who just said, sometimes it's impossible to be absolutely fair in this imperfect world without transgressing some even more important duty. Well, that's a hard thought, but there it is. Now, that's what I was talking about. I'm getting finished now, and the last bit is the difficult one. It's what our responsibility is for all of this. Are we responsible for the fair use of our assessments, for example, for university entrance, those who work on A-levels or Scottish Highers or whatever? Now, there's two views by the assessment theorists. I think I'd call it a narrow view and a wider view. The narrow view is Messick. It's really only if the consequences, the unfair consequences, can be traced to the sources of the test invalidity are the test community responsible for it. And then Cronbach and those who followed him were a bit wider and said, well, even if the consequences can't be traced to the aspect of the test, the validators have an obligation to review whether a practice has appropriate consequences for individuals and institutions, and particularly to argue against adverse consequences. And the standards is sort of on the side of Cronbach with that. Well, for what it's worth, my own view, the moral perspective on what we do in our work is not an optional extra perspective. It is, by definition, the overriding perspective, and that's what life is all about. I do think there must be a reasonable limit to the amount that test designers and providers, people who work in exam boards, for example, can be expected to anticipate how lunatic ministers 15 years later might use their exams. There must be some sort of limit to that. However, if the use of our assessments is making social injustice worse, often these factors are all linked to each other. Educational disadvantage is not hermetically sealed from poverty, from social disadvantage, from family, a mishap, from ill health and all the rest of it. But if the use of our assessments is actually making that situation worse, I would say, and what Jonathan Wolfe calls a corrosive disadvantage, is actually making it worse, then I suggest we have a duty to say so. And I believe that we have a professional and a moral responsibility to keep the uses of our assessments under review and to speak out, if necessary, to advocate clarity about what the scores do represent and what they don't, and to say that. So, for example, if the outcomes of one assessment are just lumped together with another one and then it's used for some purpose which doesn't hold together, I don't think we say, well, we don't do that, we're just the exam board. I think there's a duty to speak out. That's my view. And I would leave with you a thought. One of the things I did in my shadowy past was to be an ombudsman for complaints about health services. And from an ex-ombudsman, take it from me, the public do not accept parts of the state or the public service who pass the blame from one to another. You know, if it wasn't the hospital, it was the GP. Oh, it wasn't the GP, it was the purchasing authority or the provider or the nurse or whoever. They say, I don't care who it was, my mother wasn't treated properly. Well, similarly, in the world of exams, the public is not interested in people shifting the blame. Now, those of you who are biblical scholars will know about Adam and Eve after the fall. Adam and Eve were Glaswegians, so Adam said, it wasn't me, it was Eve. And Eve said, it wasn't me, it was the serpent. Well, all I would say to you is the public are not interested in that. They see us all as them, and we're all we, if you like. And although we have our individual roles in the world of assessment and its use, I would suggest we have a duty to participate in the wider community and to contribute our expertise to it. We can't just say, it wasn't me, it's nothing to do with it, it's just the regulator, it's just the government, it's just the Ofsted or whoever. That goes down absolutely zero with the wider public. And finally, if you remember two things. One is, please don't unquestionably use the cake paradigm all the time, because it takes you down a line where you don't allow a lot of consideration to be brought in, and it's very narrow. And the other thing I would suggest to those of you who like reading theoretical things about assessment is that validity is not the be-all and the end-all. There may be more important things in life. That's it. Thank you very much.
Gibb is the Minister for Schools, and he's written to me this week. He's written to all the deans of schools of education and said that from now on the cake paradigm must not be allowed. We've got to look for potential, because as you know there's a shortage of teachers. And so I think there's a sense from the Minister for Schools that we've got this cake that we share out amongst our applicants, and now we've dropped that and look for their potential. We always have actually, but here in the School of Education and the University of Hertfordshire, but he's written to me, and I just wondered if you've been whispering in his ear. No?
I can't say that I have. I'd just say that there's two things really. One is how you select in a limited number of for a limited number of places. The other is that some of the assessments you use are not about selection for a limited number of places. They're about getting more information about the person for the best outcome. And there's room for everybody. That's the other side. I guess you'll still have to make selection decisions, whether you do it on potential. The problem with that is, whether your measurements of potential are reliable. And there's a tendency still in the West to think there's a sort of thing called a person's true ability, which is a little box which is hidden inside their brain somewhere that you can sort of get out like that. So that's difficult as well. But I'm glad that Mr. Gibb has been reading good books.
Yes, we're looking to the right people. And he's going to come and check up on us all to check that we are really looking at potential and not turning away bad people using the cake paradigm. Now, I'm sure you've got some questions. So, first person.
Yes.
I was very interested in the graph about halfway through, which was that actually those students from the poorest backgrounds, I think it was American,
Yes.
Who got the highest. So these are students for whom the contextual offers have not been made.
Yes. Yes.
We're still the most likely
Not to complete college.
And I wanted to ask, A, do we have anything like that that's been measured in Britain? And B, did they give the reasons? I can make some good from my own experience, and which is not necessarily valid, looking at several hundred. But I'd be interested to know what their reasons they came up with were.
I could say a little bit about Robert Putnam, but I think about this country, I'd have to think about that. His argument is that all these factors cluster, not just about family life, about opportunities for developmental activities, about how often families eat meals together, health, morbidity and mortality, poverty, housing, relationships with siblings, abuse in the family, everything all links together, including educational disadvantage. And that as society has fragmented more, the top group have gone further and further away from the bottom group. And part of that's just a judgment by him about bringing together a whole lot of things. But he was looking for primary sources, and so those stats are, they were the best they could get from the American system, so I wouldn't question the actual graph. But there's a whole question about what the reasons for it are, and there's a feeling that it's all part of a whole dividing up of society. I mean, the reason the book's called Our Kids is a rather evidence-less assertion, but he claims that the previous generation in an American town, when they said our kids do this, they'd have meant the kids in the town. But nowadays they mean their own. If you say our kids, you mean your own children. And so it's very much just them. And so things like scouts and all these things that they all used to go to in camps, they now it's just the rich children that go to it. So there's something about all of that. But that's about America. In terms of this country, and of course we don't have such a thing about college completion that they do in America, do we? On the whole, there's a horror of dropouts in university statistics, which is different from America, where it's particularly in community colleges, it's very, very common to drop out. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you do.
No, I don't know the answer to it,
but I was very shocked when I saw that graph. I just thought it was terrible.
Well, I'm from Virginia originally.
Right.
And like Florida is a very southern state, so looking at the statistics you showed there was getting a bit of a flashback to when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s. And I remember the system was, if you went to preschool or nursery school, they immediately put you in a top set. If you did not, you're in a lower set. And what was very obvious to me when I was in kindergarten, that first year of primary school, there was one black kid in my set. Jared, I'll never forget him. And all the other black kids were in the lower set, and a few white kids. And then after that year, they then put you into 3 sets, upper, middle, lower. And I didn't know until later what the strategy is to deal with the three groups. The upper, they build you up to make you successful in life. With the middle, their goal is to get you into the upper set. And the bottom set, they were a waste of time. And they did neglect them entirely. And when I started doing my PhD on American history and got into civil rights and sort of thing, I didn't realize they were setting those kids up, in my generation, to fail.
Yeah.
And their race was the most obvious distinction between who succeeded, who didn't. But these kids were set up to fail deliberately.
That's really sobering and very interesting. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I just like, thank you very much, it was a lovely talk. I would like to bring to everybody's attention something from my own life. I was a postdoctoral fellow in South Africa. So I used to teach at the university there, specifically in Cape Town. And they have done there what the second suggestion, what you were suggesting, that instead of a course, to enter a course, instead of 3 Bs from that they would require from white people,
Yes.
or advantaged people, they would require 3 Cs or a D from a black person to enter university. And when you look at it as a first thought, it's a great idea, because something needs to be done to push up these people that they were disadvantaged at the time. And I think it does have a great benefit to them in the long term. The one disadvantage that I saw as a scientist there and as a teacher there is that the gap, the social gap that generates, like your friend that was saying to his son, it's an unfair world.
Yes.
It is huge. You're trying to close the gap, but do you actually close that gap, or you're making it wider? Because now everybody's looking, and instead of thinking at the disadvantaged person, instead of saying, oh, this person did not have the life that I had, regardless of whether I wanted it or not. I got a better education, I have a better house, I have food on my table all the time, I don't have to go to work when I'm 10 or 11. They look at them and they see, this person is going to take my place at university, this person later on is going to take my place in the workforce, and I'm going to be forced to leave the country, because I saw these are facts. So it's something that has been tried, your second suggestion.
Yes.
That's the only place I know. And I don't think it's very, very successful, because it does generate this huge social gap between the poor and the well-off. And it's actually very depressing.
Thank you for that. I'm getting even more depressed as we go on. Yes.
I feel like, backing you up here, I feel like you're right in saying that it creates segregation. It could open up all sorts of things, other issues that you have in schools, like bullying. Oh my God, you can only have to get a C, I have to get whatever these, all that sort of stuff. But surely assessments are only based on what we teach in a curriculum. Surely the crux of it is that you have to make the curriculum accessible for all in the first place, because your assessments are built on the curriculum that you're teaching. So if the curriculum, for example, English is a prime example, we teach AQA English. A couple of years ago they decided, we can't teach any foreign authors in AQA examinations, in GCSE examinations anymore. So now you're closing the gap hugely in such a cultural society. Hatfield, which is where I teach, is a melting pot. We have loads of foreign students, high percentile EAL and all this sort of stuff. And our curriculum isn't accessible for them. They get there, I'm teaching them Shakespeare, and they're like, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. And even our kids, English kids already, who are not big readers, because again, we have issues in literacy and all this blah, 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 they also don't find that text accessible. So surely the first thing to combat issues in assessment is to make sure that the curriculums are open for everyone to understand in the first place, because that's what our assessments are based on anyway.
Yes, and I think it's going back to the accessibility and to curriculum and to teaching materials and good quality teaching. Another solution that some people, I didn't go into it, was to have, in addition to grades, which are linked to curriculum, have some other kind of test which is not supposed to be linked to the curriculum, like the medical school entry test or the law school test. And in decades gone by, they might have tried some sort of quotes intelligence test. And in America, where the high school grades are just make no pretense at being comparable, really, they're sort of similar, but not very. They use another test as well. And the reason they do it is because at least it's something that they can claim is fair, even if it's not terribly relevant to what the student's going to do. That's the argument that's often used. So, but I think against that, I think most people would say that it's very difficult to have a test that has no relation to the curriculum at all. It sort of becomes, you've thrown everything out and you've got very little left. And it's very debatable how useful these are.
My other kind of question as well is if we're focusing purely on the entrance to university, say
it's just an example.
Say we're taking that as the kind of the discussion we're having at the moment. What about students that don't get into university and then get into another university on clearing? So clearing is a whole process where you haven't achieved your grades, and it kind of removes that cake diagram again because you haven't received your grades, but you're still going to go to university in another place that's probably going to accept you. Or universities even lowering their grade standards for clearing because they haven't met the quota that they need for students for that course. Or all these other things. Universities that need to meet minority quotas, all that sort of stuff. It's all very subjective. There's so many different things playing into it that how can you really compare two students and go, this one got in with 3 A's, whatever, but actually in July when the grades came out, we didn't have enough kids, so I'm now accepting this one with 2 C's and a B, whatever. So it becomes
a very complex area, and this is what universities have to argue their way through. They don't want to lower their standards, they want to make sure that students are going to benefit from the course, but they've got to try and be, quotes, fair. And if you compared it with people deciding where they want to go for their holidays, you wouldn't think, well, it's not fair that he can go to France and I can go to Germany. You're trying to pick what's best for you, and it becomes a bit like that and less like a competition. But there are always going to be some universities where entrance is highly competitive. And it'd be wrong to pretend that wasn't the case. And there is the problem with medical school, where you can get, say, 400 qualified applicants for 25 places.
Yeah.
And as some of you may know, in Queen Mary College in London and 1 or 2 places in Holland, they tried to do the shortlisting by a lottery. They just picked out and then they did the final interviews, and there was an outcry. The public was shocked and said how terrible that was. My daughter's dream has been destroyed by the toss of a coin, and how terrible that was. So, but on the other hand, it was probably as fair as anything else.
Another question? Anyone else?
Yes, I think you're the last.
Just about, you mentioned about just a lottery. Do they use psychometric testing as well? I mean, you mentioned potential for...
Yes, I mean, there's a whole world of whether psychometric testing is going to be more valuable than achievement in an unequal education system on its own. And often people try to use a mixture of the two. There's a whole separate debate about the quotes fairness of psychometric testing. Just to leave you with an anecdote, when I sat the civil service exams when I was at university, this was the days when they were heavily into psychometric testing. And one of the questions was about arranging dominoes, and I'd never been taught how to play dominoes, and I couldn't do it. You had to know how to play dominoes to do the test. So I had to write, I do not know how to, I remember to the day when I was sitting when I wrote it, I do not know how to play dominoes, I wrote down. And that was a classic example of a construct irrelevant bias in the test. But there's a similar debate to have, not tonight, you'll be relieved to know, about psychometric testing, both about its theoretical basis, but also about how it relates to tests of educational achievement. And also we get to competency tests. On the whole, the best indication of how people are going to perform in a profession in the future is how they've performed in the past. And the more you can get something realistic for that, it's probably the best for everybody, but it's a difficult one to put into practice.
Okay. Are you okay with dominoes now, by the way?
Sort of, yes.
Sounds
I'm in my mid-30s I was taught to play
Oh, that's
dominoes.
good. Isabel, thank you so much. It's been fabulous.
Thank you.